Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Procurement 2025, Is Digital Transformation Driving More Effective Procurement? It's my pleasure to introduce myself, Simon Watson, Principal at Officio, and also my co-presenter, Pete Weatherall, also a Principal at Officio. So before we get into the results of the study that we conducted, it's probably worth giving you a bit of a background on the reasons for doing this study and what really motivated us to conduct this piece of thought leadership. I think we all know, and it's not new to anybody, that technology is having significant impact on our own personal lives and has been for many years now. The way we communicate, the way we network, the way we make purchases, the way we take taxi rides. We couldn't have imagined the situation we have today just 15 or 20 years ago. Businesses too have been making inroads into this digital transformation, but perhaps not at quite the same pace. Officio has been on a digital journey itself, and in particular, we've built technology that's allowed some of our clients to do work that our consultants do and used to do. Things like spend classification, sourcing analytics, understanding complex commercial supplier agreements. And what it has meant that is that our consultants now have a slightly different skill set to what they did 10 years ago when I started in consulting. What we don't know is where this journey will end, but what we certainly do know is that because technology is ever changing, the journey is certainly far from over. And it's really been our experience of this digital journey that has motivated us to see how other businesses are faring and how they're approaching their own digital journeys. We've had a number of clients ask us those sorts of questions as well. And so we put this study together and collaborated with our partners at Cranfield University to ensure some academic rigor, and published the results of this study at the back end of last year. And what I'll do now is take you through the main highlights, and then, as I mentioned before, we've got some time for some questions and answers at the end. So in terms of the survey methodology, we wanted to make sure that this was a comprehensive, all-encompassing study. In terms of the industries that participated in this study, we had the full range. We wanted to make sure it wasn't biased to any particular one. You can see that a lot of the industries there are very well represented. We really tried to cover the full spectrum. In terms of respondents, then we had an even split from Officio's key markets in the US, the UK, and Germany. We had 225 respondents in total, and 75 from each of those markets. And then in terms of the people that we spoke to, about 3/4 of them had procurement in their title, 20% were operational leaders, and about 5% in finance. But the important thing is that all of those people who responded were responsible in some or full part for their procurement functions. And then finally, in terms of the size of these organizations, then again, we managed to cover the full spectrum. I think the smallest company that participated had an annual spend volume of approximately $50 million, and we went right up to multi-billion-dollar spend organizations. So with that, we're very confident that we covered the full range. We've made this a very fair survey, and that it's not necessarily biased towards any particular industry or type of role. So in terms of the results and the findings themselves, the first section here is around procurement today. So what did we find about the state of procurement in 2018 when we did the study? Firstly, we found that digitalization and digital transformation is driving an awful lot of activity, and that's perhaps unsurprising. The first indication of that was that the most common number one procurement objective for organizations in 2018 was transforming processes with technology. We also found that about 4/5 of respondents agreed with the statement that digital transformation should be a boardroom priority, and then a further 2/3 were agreeing with the fact that they completely rethought their approach to procurement due to new technology. So we can see there's a lot of activity being driven by digital. However, we thought this was masking a slightly different reality, and what we also found in the same study was that about half of people admitted to embarking on a digital journey and making technology purchases through a fear of missing out rather than fully understanding the benefits that digital transformation could bring to them.
I think that's an interesting point to just pick up on there, Simon, around such a high percentage of purchasing decisions people are kind of almost admitting to less based on a defined problem and a defined need, and more just a fear of falling behind the competition. It's certainly something that I've seen before, and it's worth thinking about what some of the reasons for this are. I think it's quite a challenging environment in today's world for people to make purchasing decisions around technology. I think if we think about the past, where largely through the last 3-4 decades, technology in business has been way ahead of consumer technology in terms of its sophistication, and it's been where the leading edge innovation has been. Today's world is very different. You know, you could be on your commute to work, you could be having all this AI on your mobile phone, you could have a mobile phone that knows where you parked your car, where you live without telling it, and everything's at a touch of a button or the swipe of a finger. And then you get to work and you have to log into maybe a very antiquated user interface, where you're using a very old version of some established ERP system, and it's kind of confusing for the general workforce to think, well, in my personal life, I have touch of the button access to such innovation, but at work it's very, very different. And I think this then as well enforces and reinforces a culture of wanting almost gadgets to satisfy needs, and wanting to do things smart, but not being quite sure why. So this is quite dangerous, right? Because I think the undertone to what we're saying here, which is people are making a lot of decisions through fear of missing out, is that perhaps there's a little bit of a lack of digital literacy across the people that are making these purchasing decisions to understand, well, this is the clear problems we need to solve, and this is the logical order in which to solve them. And instead they're chasing after the latest buzz thing, whether it is, you know, some sort of OCR recognition to scan documents, whether it is another, you know, latest trend, which is a technology which can be made useful, but is only useful if it's understood what the problem is it's going to solve. So it's a really interesting finding, I think, that we didn't expect to see in this study.
Yeah, and it's true. I mean, we've both been in conversations with companies where you know, they've explained what it is that they're trying to buy, what it is that they would like to get, but you know, through a bit of questioning, it's quite clear that as you say, Pete, that need is not really understood. And I think you're absolutely right. It does become dangerous because these systems don't always come cheap. They often mean a change in the way of working for their employees, which can create disruption in itself. And so really, you know, understanding the benefits of what this digital transformation is going to bring you is absolutely paramount in our view, before diving in and making purchases in technology.
Yeah, and I think the other challenge that this delta between the sophistication of consumer technology and commercial technology at the moment is the amount of risk. It's not, you know, it's not that technologies aren't available today. I went to a good speech at a conference a few months ago where they were describing the holiday of the future and talking about, you know, 3D printing some of your luggage and being able to speak into your phone and auto translate into the language of the destination you visited, and talking about all these potentially futuristic technologies. And the reality is they all exist today and they all work today. So why are people not being able to piece them together and make the most of them? And it's about policy, it's about protocol, it's about risk. You know, as a consumer, you can make a split-second decision to sign up to a Gmail account. The issue there is you don't know what you're signing away. the reason a lot of this technology today for consumer is free is not because these companies are good-natured and they want to help you. It's because they want something back. They want the information, they want the data. If you're not paying for the product, the chances are you are the product. Businesses can't take risks like that. They can't behave in quite the same way. And again, that's a big challenge with all of this in terms of a lot of the technology. If we're talking about digital procurement and what the technical components required to make that happen are, they do all exist today. What doesn't quite exist is the policies, the processes, the protocols to actually glue that together and make it realistically be something that an executive board can sign up to. So again, that creates quite a frenzied environment when it comes to purchasing procurement technology.
Good. Okay. So if we move on to the next section, which is around digital procurement tomorrow, there's a few things we wanted to point out here. Firstly, we asked our respondents what the expected benefits of technology were going to be in the future. And if we look at the number one expected benefit of technology and the responses we had, then quite clearly out in the lead there is faster, higher and more sustainable savings. And we'll return to that shortly. We'd also like to point out another couple of responses there, in particular, more fact-based decision-making. Again, it's worth remembering that technology can enable huge amounts of insight and an ability for people and companies to make decisions that are actually based on facts and data. And it removes the reliance to a certain extent for them to make decisions on experience or based on relationships. And that really, in our view, can lead to much more positive outcome-driven actions. More strategic procurement is also mentioned in there, and it's probably worth just giving a take and a perspective on that. More strategic procurement is, a phrase which has been around for at least 20 years, if not more, but what does it actually mean? I think one interpretation of that is how businesses can essentially reduce the amount of time they spend on essentially a data overhead. And by data overhead, we mean acquiring, analyzing, and trying to generate insights from data. Now, all of those three steps are necessary. They're very, very important, but they're extremely time-consuming. And crucially, none of those actually leads to an outcome. It's only acting on the insights that are generated that leads to a positive outcome and can actually generate some value for procurement and the organization. And so, in our view, digital transformation and technology can really help to minimize the time that's spent on acquiring, analyzing, and generating insights from data in such a way that people can then actually spend more time acting on that and generating value for their organizations.
I think this is a really important point, Rex. I think a part of the shift to procurement being more strategic is that they're in a very unique position in a business, and that they sit in the interface between the supply chain and the business. So the amount of potential data, if processes and technology are working correctly, that passes through procurement is enormous. So the business intelligence opportunity within that function is significant. So if they can get a handle in procurement on not just how to collect all of this data in a standardized, structured way, but to actually pull in some really insightful reporting, then they really elevate their position in the business, right? Because they have the intelligence. And it's not just about purchasing then, it becomes about far more. It can really help with much broader business decision making. Because, again, if you can find an effective manner of pulling in granular data from your strategic suppliers, really understanding unit costs of key components of the business, this can really help with strategic decision making. I think the other thing to point out there as well is around the faster, higher, and more sustainable savings. I think this is a really crucial point. So, obviously, savings is a key cornerstone of most procurement functions. Most teams will have a target to hit, and I think the sustainable part is the really important piece here. There are many categories where you can go and source them, and actually half the work is done in that sourcing process. Yes, you can run a very professional, effective process to get a good outcome, but especially in many indirect categories, in many service type categories where you're procuring, the key difference is going to be in contractual compliance. It's going to be on making sure that the deal you put in place has happened. Whenever you finish a strategic sourcing process and you've executed it, you typically end up with two things fundamentally. Firstly, you have a set of prices, and secondly, quite simply, you have a set of promises. And if you're not able to track and monitor that both of those things are happening, the chances are that they're not, that things are not going quite rightly. And so by putting in place process to handle data in an effective way, you can also help unlock and ensure that all the savings that have been put in place are actually realised and they hit the bottom line and they are far more sustainable.
Thanks, Pete. So we've talked about procurement today, we've talked about procurement tomorrow. Next, it's worth talking a little bit about the barriers to going from today to tomorrow. And this was a key section for our survey, asking people what they thought the main barriers were to realizing the benefits of technology. Now, if we look at some of the responses on the slide, some of these might not be a huge surprise to you. Lack of talent was number one. So lack of talent to realize the power of machines. That's lack of talent essentially to use technology. Out in the front, 72%. Another big one as well was lack of vendor support in implementing solutions. Just like to concentrate on those two for a second. In terms of the lack of talent one, I think what we feel and what we see is that procurement teams of the future are going to need more data scientists. They're going to need people who are able to look at masses of data and draw insights and meaning from it. And I think people have known that for a couple of years now. But I think we're also going to need people in procurement who understand technology, have a basic understanding of how software is built to be able to manage that data contained within it. It's also worth remembering that digitalization is not all about the technology. It's about how humans and technology can complement each other. So it's worth thinking about how the role of the human is going to develop in the future as technology becomes more mainstream in businesses and advances. The other point that we think is lying behind this issue of lack of talent is, as procurement technology focuses on the automation of some of the more basic tasks or some of the more transactional tasks, then it will push people, as we said previously, into more strategic activity. And some people in procurement functions today might be exposed through that. At the very least, they need to make sure that they're reinventing themselves, and their companies need to help them to do that. Lack of vendor support in implementing solutions was a very interesting one too. And, especially when you look at the least cited barrier here, which is technology not being fit for purpose. So, the inverse there means that people generally think that their technology exists. However, they don't feel that they have the support of vendors to implement those solutions. There could be many reasons for that. I guess on the one side, you could say that if a technology vendor is incentivized by selling licenses, it means that they have this kind of sell and walk away type relationship with their client potentially, and are less incentivized to really kind of see it through and make sure that the benefits are reaped from that investment. I think if you look at it from the technology vendor's perspective, they might say, well, that's all well and good, but if we're going to have some skin in the game, then that's going to cost a bit of money too, and you're going to need to pay for it. So I think there's a bit of work to be done there in terms of the relationship between vendors and clients when it comes to that.
I think another way of interpreting that as well is that, again, if you link this back to some consumer technology, if you just bought Spotify without any music in it, it's not particularly interesting or helpful. It's the content that's really valuable. So the technology can be fantastic. The buttons can all work as you want them to. But in fact, the thing that makes people's lives easier is having content on hand. So, having an e-sourcing suite that's full of templates of how to source a category is incrementally more useful than just having the mechanics where you have to work it out yourself. And so I think there's a bit of a delta there as well in saying the technology works, but the technology providers don't necessarily have the content to fill it with and understand that. That's the people in the business. But there's an investment needed. There's work up front to get the technology to a level where it becomes really effective. So that's potentially something to explain this difference in views. I think we had a really interesting discussion on this point at our launch event back in November. So it'd be a good time just to play a video now, which was tackling the question of, do you believe that procurement's technology is fit for purpose?
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, so we'll play that video now. We had a panel of 7 industry people, and as Pete says, we put this question to them. So we'll just play the video now. It will take a couple of seconds to come up.
It's not the age to engineer out buyers from transactions yet. I don't think AI is going to replace the procurement process in the next couple of years with people. But I think if you want a system, if you want an e-procurement system to reduce maverick purchasing, if you want a contract management system for contract authoring, it actually works now.
Actually, I think it's less to do with the technology than it is to do with the people, the processes and the policies. We talk about digitization and we think it's just a technology play. It is not. Organizations will implement technology and think it's going to solve the problem. And what they've failed to do is to bring their entire workforce on the journey with them. And that is part and parcel.
And unfortunately, the technology that I see today, by and large, that services my function, still assumes that I will always be in the center controlling how things get purchased. Yeah. And I don't think, as somebody who wants to provide a valuable service to my organization, that is a sustainable proposition. Yeah. So in my area, I'm looking for new technology solutions that help get procurement out of the way. I'm looking for ways in which I can make the experience of dealing with my function frictionless.
Yeah. This is down to belief and it's down to trust. Firstly, you're going to have to say that, if I'm going to rely on the technology to deliver the things you've asked it to, I have to trust it. A lot of organizations still don't want to trust that, and they say, well, actually, I need somebody to check X and Y and Z because I'm not prepared to turn the lights out. And that's a change in belief and a change in behavior.
I am so surprised that people still think like we did 25 years ago. I'm so astonished. The most important part in procurement is making your specifications. If you are able to make your specifications correctly, the rest of procurement is a workflow. If you would make it fully digital, procurement could look in the background and use the data that is generated through the whole system to provide any check you want to have, any guidance you want to have, anything. You will be the Google on the background of your whole procurement process.
Okay, so a clip there from our launch event, and going to now move on to the next part of the study, which is looking at the 5-year vision and how to achieve a 5-year vision here. We've split this into 3 key elements. Firstly, developing strategic supplier relationships, accessing the right skills, and also building a knowledge platform. We're going to share some insights from the survey related to each of these and some of our thoughts on this. So in terms of strategic supplier relationships and the development of those, I guess a bit of background from the survey here. We found that about 2/3, so 64% of respondents agreed with the statement that strategic supplier relationships will be more important in the future to helping companies achieve their procurement objectives. What we also found was that only about half of those companies had actually selected their strategic suppliers formally. Formal selection criteria did not exist, and evaluations have not taken place for about half of those companies. So that suggests that there's still quite a bit of sourcing work to be done to just identify who those partners of the future are going to be. And it's worth as well dwelling on what we mean by a strategic supplier relationship. And in the survey, we asked our respondents how they thought that these relationships should be characterized. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the number one characterization, with about 3/4 agreeing, was transparent commercials. So transparent commercials is a bit of the utopia, I suppose, for a procurement organization. It allows you to be sure, ultimately, that you're getting the best value from your suppliers. It allows you to benchmark through the supply chain, and it allows you to understand you're getting that best deal. But perhaps refreshingly, and perhaps a little surprisingly, the other three characterizations in the top four, so that's long-term commitments, early engagement with suppliers, and demand visibility, are all things that it is in the power of the client and the company to give away to the supplier. And I think what we found quite refreshing about this is that companies understand that in order to get something like transparent commercials from their suppliers and their most trusted suppliers, they're going to have to give something away in return. If you think about the three that we've got there, long-term commitments, early engagement, demand visibility, these are all things that can be enabled by technology. If you just take demand visibility as one, understanding what it is you're going to be buying, forecasting out into the future is going to require an element of gathering data, requirements, putting those together smartly, generating insights from that. And that's very difficult with an offline Excel type process, much more easy with some technology. So these are really things which technology can enable. And the sort of corollary here is that by giving these three things away and others, can actually get more transparent commercials and ensure you're getting the best deal. And that kind of ties into the savings point we had as being a key benefit from technology earlier on.
I think just to expand there a little bit as well, Simon, I think in terms of developing that strategic supplier relationships, the really key word in that is relationships, and thinking about what does that mean? Do you truly want to build partnerships with these strategic suppliers, or do you want to keep going with a more parent-child type supplier-vendor approach? Because it's obvious, but it's very true. If I'm a supplier and I need to go and build a table for my client, if that client brings me in early on and says, this is the problem statement, this is what we're trying to solve, can you help me do this? Then the chances of that supplier helping do it cheaper, more sustainably at a better price are far greater than if you piecemeal over the course of a year, say, I need a chair leg, I need a tabletop, I need this bulk. You're never going to get the efficiencies, you're never going to get the value out of that. So it's really key, and it's not for every relationship in the supply chain, but where there's opportunities to get efficiency. We talk about supplier innovation, supplier development a lot, and actually the first step for supplier innovation and supplier development is not putting in an RFP to a supplier. You have to be innovative and you have to develop. It's about the client sitting there and saying, what can we do as a business to provide more information, more support, more for our supplier to thrive and do better? And that's clear. That's what's come out in the study here as well, I think.
Yeah, and I think we'll perhaps see a clip on it soon, but I think one of the bugbears of some suppliers is they want to be engaged early in that process. They struggle to meet the needs and meet the expectations of clients if they're, I guess, given a list of requirements, which, as you say, Pete, without the problem statement, it's very difficult to do something with that. The second part of this 5-year vision triangle was around access to the right skills, and we've talked a little bit about this already with the results around barriers and lack of talent being one of them. And I guess we've mentioned too the fact that we think in future procurement people are going to need to be more analytical, more data driven, and they're going to need to have a certain level of technology literacy. I think if you look into the future, it makes sense that procurement will be made up from a smaller core of strategic resources and supported by sort of malleable, flexible layer of expertise, depending on the needs at any particular moment of the procurement function. I think the good analogy here is looking at the legal function. If you look at the legal function of any large company, they have many lawyers, but those lawyers tend to be generalists or at least specialized in matters that come up time and time again in that company, but then there are always additional matters that come up that the company has to deal with, and that's when they start engaging with specialists and providers to get that expertise. So I think procurement could go that way as well. And you have to ask yourself, with all of this technology now and the the automation of insights, if companies can achieve that, then does it really make sense to have somebody who is let's say an IT category expert sitting full time doing an IT sourcing process from start to finish, when actually a lot of the work there could be automated or at least done through technology, and then they get brought in perhaps at key meetings with stakeholders to give some SME input or indeed negotiate at key times with suppliers, and that's really the kind of model that I think we might be moving towards. And then thirdly, developing a knowledge platform. If we look at the survey, one of the biggest barriers to meeting 5-year objectives cited by our survey respondents was a lack of knowledge. And what do we mean by a lack of knowledge? Well, if we think that the future is data-driven decision making, then that data-driven decision making will come from companies organizing and applying its knowledge. And this is not just capturing data, but it's also capturing the circumstances around the data that has been created. So for example, if we've got some benchmark pricing, that's all well and good, but it's more rich to have an understanding of the circumstances in the market around when that pricing was agreed with providers, for example. I think the key thing to say here, though, is that building a knowledge platform is something that takes a bit of time to get a return on, and it's not something that you can start today and get benefits tomorrow. It's something where you need to put a stake in the ground and be patient, and over time the knowledge that you begin to build will become more and more useful. And it's key as well to make sure that when building a knowledge platform, there are the processes in place to ensure that knowledge is constantly iterated and the quality of that data is improved.
So, and I think picking up on the talent piece here that we mentioned, and access to the right skills, that's obviously a slightly controversial piece. And again, we had a really good discussion at the launch panel about this topic around what are the real skills in procurement that are needed for the future, and is there a talent gap, or is it a case of retraining and upskilling?
Yeah, so I think we're going to have a quick look at another clip from our launch event there around lack of talent. So we put this question to our panel: is lack of talent a barrier to realizing benefits of technology? And we'll see now what our panel had to say about that. So if you can just bear with us for 2 or 3 seconds while this loads.
We are spending less and less time on data and crunching. For my organization, I think the procurement person or the people that we look at, they need to understand the product, what the company does.
Well, it depends how you look at procurement for the future. The way we look at it is that when we would be able to use more advanced systems, the role of procurement will change into more like category management in retail, making sure the right suppliers are on the platform before people want to use them. And for that reason, we need different people. People with a different attitude, people who are understanding the business, quite right what you're saying, are able to translate business plans into what third parties do I need in the future, making sure that they are qualified, risk assessed, pre-contracted, and available.
I get quite cross with this whole talk about talent and the war for talent. The future of work is a very different set of educational requirements. What we need is people to recognize that if they don't equip themselves with new tools, new understanding, learn how to code, learn what data visualization means, learn regression analysis, knowledge has never been as cheap as it is today. If people are not motivated to take up that knowledge, they're never going to learn.
Yeah.
And if they're never going to learn, they're probably going to be highly statistically likely to be made redundant in the next 10 to 15 years. So for me, it's not so much about the lack of talent, it's that generally speaking, the skill sets that we need for the future of work are in short supply.
Yeah.
And what we as leaders need to do, I think, is motivate our teams to understand you need to change your skills.
Yeah.
The skills that you got were deficient.
It might not be lack of talent, but what you yourself were saying about we're kind of the policeman that everyone's trying to avoid, so therefore you never really get to add value. Maybe this is a cynical thing to think, but often that's kind of a type of person, and that's the way they do things.
Yeah.
And getting them to suddenly become a innovator and a stakeholder management person is quite hard. So it might not be so much about talent, but the right kinds of people, some more business people.
And that's what you've got to decide is, does my business want me to be that sort of an innovator? Do they expect that of the procurement function? If the answer is no, then you've probably got the right people for the job today.
Yeah.
Because if you are if you've got a procurement organisation that isn't expected to do anything but beat up suppliers and be a process junkie, then what's wrong with it? That's right. Yeah. What's wrong with the talent that you've got? If, however, you've got an organisation that does want procurement to, bring insights or, bring more value or contribute to top-line revenue growth, then maybe your current composition needs to evolve.
It's all very well we say we've got machine learning, we've got AI. Somebody's got to train the machines. Somebody's got to be able to create the algorithms that are going to be able to do what you want to do. Somebody's got to be able to interpret the data. Some of you may be familiar with this concept of DIKW, data, insight, knowledge, wisdom. To get there, somebody's got to be able to interpret it. And the skill sets, again, are very different because there's almost a translation layer as well.
So we just wanted to leave with some, or at least conclude this presentation with some final thoughts on what it means about making procurement more effective. And we'd like to offer a hypothesis here on how this could be applied to strategic sourcing. It's something that we strongly believe is possible. We've seen elements of this with many companies. And to understand it, we take a starting point. The first thing that we see with companies is a lot of time sunk in acquiring information that actually should and could already be readily available to procurement. So this is things like making basic information such as spend and contract data available, understanding the main suppliers that we're spending with, having some granular detail behind that, understanding products and services that we're buying from them, and then also from the contracts, which contracts do we have, which categories are they covering, how much contract coverage do we have, when are these contracts expiring, what are the kind of SLAs and KPIs there. So oftentimes getting that information is time consuming because it's not in one place. So that we think there's a significant time saving there in just making that available through technology. Secondly, we talk about this concept of a control tower. So what we've experienced with many companies is there's quite a lot of time lost running low value initiatives or running many concurrent initiatives. And having a project management system that allows you to see which resources are working on which initiatives and what the ROI on those individual initiatives are, what the risks of those initiatives are, having all that information in real time and live allows you to essentially sit in the procurement war room and redeploy resources as necessary, turn initiatives on and off, and ensure that you're getting the most value from the initiatives that you're running. Then we move on to the value that we see is often lost through deploying suboptimal approaches. So this is often, if you're going out sourcing a particular category, not understanding the total cost of ownership, the individual cost elements that make the total cost. Not having all of the suppliers engaged that you could do because the manual process is quite time-consuming to engage the number of suppliers you might want to. And again, validating approaches with experts, being able to do that can save an awful lot of time by having a type of knowledge platform that we talked about in the earlier slide. Then when it comes to the actual sourcing itself, So sourcing automation here. Now, there are many e-sourcing systems around. They've been around for a long time, but how many companies have really mastered the art of being able to just rerun sourcing events? If we think about many categories, they often need to be sourced regularly, at least once every 2 years, in many cases more frequently than that. But oftentimes in procurement, we're starting from scratch every time. Having a system which allows you to automate a lot of the steps, allows you to capture that knowledge, and one that allows you to automate some of the really time-consuming tasks such as data analysis, bid analysis, and feeding that back to suppliers. We see a huge potential value in being able to automate that through technology. But perhaps the biggest one that we see is comes from the contract management side of things. As Pete said in an earlier statement, the sourcing process is all about prices and promises. Making sure those prices and promises are delivered through tracking and through holding both the company and suppliers to account ensures that a lot of the value that's created during the sourcing process does not just leak away. So this can take many forms. It can be a savings tracking process that's well trusted by finance. That means that we can track where benefits are hitting, and if they're not hitting, then we have visibility of why that is the case. Is it because we're not complying to the contracts? Are we perhaps buying from the right suppliers but buying off contract, or are we perhaps buying from the wrong suppliers? Understanding that and having visibility of compliance and now enables procurement to take that kind of corrective action, which will stop that value being lost. And I'm sure Pete got some comments on this one, but it's really a hypothesis that we see in strategic sourcing, that it really can become twice as effective. And just in case you're wondering, these percentages here, if you compound them, they do indeed equal 200%.
I think this is really reinforcing that point we talked about, which is digital transformation is not just about buying technology; it's also about using data, capturing content better, and the effective use of people and having the right skill sets in the organisation. The biggest number that strikes out there is the dynamic tracking and where you can get value at the end. And I think not only is there value to be had there, it also loops back in, because the more you track, the more you have intelligence when it comes to upfront strategy planning, when it comes to understanding what to do next. And it's a very simple analogy, but what I did in January was probably similar to many other people. I downloaded an app on my phone called MyFitnessPal, which you upload everything you eat into it, and it gives you the nutritional information. So every meal you have, you can scan the barcode, and it's very sophisticated, and it tells you exactly how much fat and protein and everything is in everything you eat. And before January, I thought I ate pretty healthily. But the moment I started doing this and started scanning this, I had a few surprises. There are certain things that I assumed were okay for me that really weren't. And it really reinforces the point that until you start monitoring, until you start tracking things, you actually don't know. You're guessing, you're assuming. And it comes exactly the same in terms of contract management, in terms of savings tracking. Until you can start to monitor and actually, with some logic, detail, this is where things are working and this is where there's some problems, the strategy piece and all the decision making just becomes, marginal guesswork. So really, it's a fundamental piece which is really important, which is to start actually tracking the outcome of what's happening. Okay. Perfect. Well, thanks for that, Simon. I think we're going to now begin answering some of the questions we've had in. Thanks everyone who's submitted questions so far. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. So we're going to start answering some of those now. So I think the first question, I'm actually going to join two together because they're kind of linked. We've got one question that's come in saying, how do you decide what kind of technologies are the best fit for an organization and are future-proof? And a second question, which I feel is linked, so we can probably discuss in the same piece, which is, what is the most common mistake that organizations make when purchasing technology for the procurement function? So I guess, because of the same sort of question, but worded in different ways, how do you succeed? How are people currently failing? What's your initial thoughts there, Simon?
Yeah, I think when it comes to buying technology, it's what we talked about already, Pete. It's around understanding and understanding what outcome it is you're trying to achieve, and then involving the potential vendors as part of that process, because they're the ones that can help innovate. They also, your table building analogy, they kind of need that overall understanding of what it is you're trying to get to, if they're really gonna help you. And we see many times companies that translate, they firstly have a perceived problem. They then translate that into a long list of technical requirements, literally a checklist in Excel, and they send that out to vendors and suppliers, and they say, can you do these 100 things? And some vendors will come back and say, we can do 80, some we can do 70, but none of those suppliers actually understands what it is the client is trying to get to. And without that understanding, they're really going to struggle to help that company make that particular investment a success.
I think my view on this topic, how to make sure you're purchasing the right technology is probably twofold. I think the first thing is not to just think about it as a technology piece. If I'm looking for a new contract management system, have I actually defined what I want to do with contract management in my business? What is it for? How far do I want to go? Is it simply to have a pipeline? Do I want to just know that these licenses auto renew at a certain period of time and someone's going to act on it? Is someone actually responsible for the output of that system and the data? Because if they're not, is anyone going to use it? And then the second point, I think, is just everyone needs to do what they can to increase their own digital literacy. It's the same with anything. If you want to go and buy a high performance car, you're going to make a better decision if you actually understand how that car works and you've done your research. You cannot buy the right software for your company without having a fundamental understanding of the differences and how that software is actually made. For example, people can be easily swayed by reporting and dashboards because they look good and they look exciting. But dashboards, if I can get an API out of a piece of software, I can get anyone to build a dashboard for me. I just need to get a person. I can install Power BI. I've probably got access to it with my Microsoft licenses anyway. So I can have a team of people that do that. And you know what? I can get them to do exactly what I want. What I'd be more interested in, what does the technology actually do? How does it create a process saving? How does it create some efficiency? And also understand that, in terms of future proofing, all of these companies have roadmaps. Engage with them and ask them what they are. Some companies versus others will be more inclined to say, if you're going to give us high quality feedback, you can be a development partner, you can work with us, you can influence our roadmap. So it's also worth not just when you're analyzing software vendors in a competitive process, don't just ask about what their technology is today, ask about what it is tomorrow. Ask how many developers they employ, how much they're investing in that piece of technology, because an RFP is just a snapshot of time. You could select one that is good today, but is not going to invest a penny more in that software for the next 5 years. So I think it's just more understanding, more literacy, more reading around the subject, and getting to a position where you can ask the right questions to find out, is this really something that the vendor cares about? Because if they care about that product, then they're going to help you make it work. Okay. So I think the next question that has been worded in a few ways, but is fairly common throughout a number of participants is, what would you recommend as the first step on a digital transformation journey? So how do you get it started?
Yeah. No, I think like this one, it's a question obviously we get a lot from companies that we meet and talk to. But I think, the ones that we've seen that are most successful are the ones that firstly they start with a vision. They understand where it is they want to take their procurement organization in the next 3 to 5 years. They've done their homework with the business to understand where the company is going, and they make sure that that's aligned. But then they also spend time understanding what the immediate steps are and the quick wins. So how can they generate momentum? What are the quick wins that are going to help them to get this roadmap really well embedded and get the confidence in the business in this roadmap? So, looking at something, even if it's just as simple as understanding spend or contract, something that can be done fairly quickly and fairly easily, but delivers a huge amount of value to the business. I guess as well, there's a bit of theory around how to actually manage a roadmap. Roadmap really is a communication tool. It shouldn't be a plan where every single activity is set in stone for the next 5 years. Roadmaps need to be flexible. They need to have an agile approach to them, such that you might well detail over the next, say, 3 to 6 months what it is you're planning on doing, but then a little bit further out than that, just an understanding of the sort of outcomes that you want, understanding that there's possibility some of those might change. And so I think, daring to dream big, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's very true in this case. And then starting small and making those sort of tangible first steps that start to generate momentum. And there are so many technologies out there. It's very confusing for technology leaders, but people should not be put off just getting the basics right. Yeah, do the basics really, really well before you start moving on to something more meaty.
I think, again, we had a fantastic debate about this with the panel at the launch event time. So I think it's worth, if you can, bring up that video. But talking about their advice on first steps to digital transformation. It'd be great to share that.
Sure. So that video is just loading now.
I think if you're a leader and you don't understand the terms that you're using, that's probably the first start. It's really important that as a leader in the organization, you understand what digitization means. You take the time to read widely in the sector. There are a lot of really good books. Kevin Kelly, who started Wired Magazine, has written a great book on various technologies. I think understanding the technologies, understanding what's out there so that you can separate the hype from the hope is really an important first step. And then making sure you understand the relevance of that for your function and how that fits into your business is the second step.
I think two simple suggestions. One is I love the phrase "brilliant at the basics," right? So, how can you become brilliant at the basics? But beyond that, the fundamental thing I've seen, which hasn't changed, is so few organizations, as a first step, have truly taken control of their spend data. As a key first step on a digital transformation, taking ownership of data. And that's not a decision to use one vendor over someone else. That says we are going to be completely data-driven. We're going to try and be as real-time as possible. And we're going to be able to explain that data to anyone the way they want to see it.
Understand why you're doing it. And then the second thing is reach out to suppliers in the market, talk to them, collaborate with them. You'll get a much better outcome.
Think about what outcome you want at the end instead of thinking about the different processes and their software names. So e-sourcing being one of 20. Think big and be brave, I think, and talk to technology vendors, because rather than just sending them forms, we won't bite you.
I think we should fundamentally, all of us, rethink how procurement should be done, and then start to define the functionality that we need and how we can make this work.
Yeah.
What we're doing today is absolutely wrong. We don't like it, procurement people don't like it, our colleagues don't like it, nobody wants it, and we're spending a huge amount of money for no reason.
Okay, so we've probably got time for one more question, Pete, and we've got one here which is probably quite close to our hearts, which is around sourcing. And somebody's asked how to get started with sourcing automation. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think, it's similar to the advice you gave in the previous question to an extent. I think start with a pilot. Don't kind of turn there and say we need to completely change our approach to sourcing for everything next year and we have to do everything as a big bang and different. I'd say what are some fairly inoffensive categories, if you like, where we can do something different. I think if you need to also define what does sourcing automation mean to me. You know, are there categories where I want to run more e-auctions? Are there categories where I want to run a very analytical, rigorous process, but I want to do it quicker? Is it something that I want to source very, very frequently? You'll find that there's potentially different technology solutions that lend themselves to all three of those things separately. So why not start 3 pilots? Work out what are the categories that are coming up where there's nothing to lose, where I should test this in the marketplace. Let's put some people around it so that we can handhold the process, but let's really define what we'd like to achieve by sourcing automation. So is it higher savings? Is it to run the process quicker? Is it to be able to capture more data, more granular data? Is it to source the category by unbundling the cost more and doing it in a more complicated manner? There could be a number of things, but define what they are, and you could have 5 or 6 pilots that run in tandem and just quickly run them, assess, and iterate. I think it can be a gradual process rather than a big bang.
Okay. Thank you, Pete, for that, and thank you everybody for attending today's webinar. Unfortunately, we're out of time now. It's also worth mentioning that there is a copy of the study and reports available to download from Officio's website. That's officioconsulting.com. We've also got more video clips from our launch event available to view there. So on behalf of Officio, thank you very much for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day.